The fire had already taken the east wing when Mira crossed the burning threshold for the 9th time. Her lungs were wrong, that was the only way to describe it. The way each breath arrived as something borrowed, something scraped from air that had already given up its oxygen to the flames. The wooden beams above her head groaned with the particular sound of a thing deciding whether to fall. She did not pause to let them decide. She moved through the smoke the way she had learned to move through everything in the last 3 years of her life. Head low, body committed, the fear folded somewhere so deep inside her chest that it had become indistinguishable from the heartbeat itself. She was carrying a pup again, the 9th one. She had not counted them as she went. She did not have the luxury of counting. She only knew, in the animal part of her that never slept and never lied, that there was one more left. There was always one more left until there wasn't. And the only way to know the difference was to go back in. The pup was small, even for a newborn 7 days old. Eyes still sealed, fur the color of river clay, lungs too new to know that screaming was a useful option. It lay motionless against Mira's chest, where she had pressed it beneath the ruined fabric of her shift, held there by the curl of her arm and the pressure of her own ribs against it, her body making itself into a vessel, a shelter, a thing that stood between new life and the absolute end of it. She was 26 years old. She had been nobody for 3 of those years officially. Documentably, ceremonially, nobody. She had no rank, no pack name, no standing before the moon or the council or any breathing creature in the territory of the Ashen Ridge. She had been rejected, stripped. She was, by every measure that her world recognized, nothing at all. And she was still on her 9th trip into the fire. The beam came down behind her as she crossed back through the threshold. She felt the heat of it across her back like a hand. Not cruel, not kind, simply enormous. The pup against her chest made a sound then, a single, small sound, like a question asked in a language with only one word. She answered it by walking faster. She did not hear the other footsteps until she had already cleared the courtyard gate. The smoke was too thick, and her ears were doing the thing they did in crisis, narrowing down to the frequency of whatever was closest and most urgent, which was the pup, and the pup alone. So she did not hear the approach of the man behind her until his hands were already closing around her shoulders. Large hands, certain hands, hands that did not grip the way someone grips a stranger, but the way someone grips something they are terrified of losing. She turned. The king of the Ironwood Pack was not supposed to be here. His territory was 40 miles east. His name was Calum Voss, and every wolf in 4 territories knew that name the way they knew thunder, not because they had chosen to learn it, but because it had simply made itself impossible to ignore. He was dark-haired and broad-shouldered, and his eyes, in the firelight that was consuming the structure behind her, were the precise amber of burning pine resin. He was looking at her the way no one had looked at her in 3 years. He was looking at her like she was something. She pulled the pup closer and held his gaze and did not look away, because Mira had stopped looking away from things the day she had decided to survive. 9, he said. His voice was low and rough, and it carried through the smoke like something solid. He had been watching, she realized. He had stood at the edge of this disaster, and he had counted. She did not answer him. There was nothing yet to say. He reached out, and with extraordinary gentleness, he placed both of his hands against her back. Not her shoulders now, her back, where the heat from the fallen beam had made a ruin of her shift, and he held them there, steady, like a door braced against a storm. And that was the beginning of the unraveling of the lie that had been her life for 3 years. Not the fire, not the pups, not the 40 miles he had crossed for reasons she did not yet understand. His hands on her back, his hands steady as a verdict. The beginning. She had not always been nobody. That was the thing that people who had never been stripped of something tended to forget, that the nobody you saw had once been a somebody, had once moved through the world with the full weight of belonging behind them, and that the stripping was not the beginning of the story. It was a rupture in the middle of one, and the story that existed before it did not simply disappear. It kept going, underneath, the way a river keeps moving beneath ice. You could not see it. It had not stopped. 3 years before the fire, Mira Calwin had been the bonded healer of the Greywater Pack. That title meant something specific in the old traditions that the Greywater Pack still observed. Not a healer in the simple sense, not someone who set bones and brewed fever breaks, though she did those things too. A bonded healer was a wolf whose gift had been formally recognized by the pack's lunar ceremony and woven into the pack's collective protection by a blood binding conducted on the full moon of their 23rd year. It meant that her gift, whatever form it took, was considered inseparable from the pack's survival. It meant she was tethered to them. It meant she was, in the deepest magical sense that the old traditions recognized, necessary. Her gift was extraordinary, and she had known it since childhood, and she had never, not once, made that knowledge into a weapon or a boast. She could feel the life in things. Not in the vague, poetic way that people sometimes described sensitivity. She meant it physically. Precisely, she could feel the presence of living breath in a structure, could sense the warmth of a heartbeat through walls and floors and rubble, could walk into a disaster and know, without instruments or guesswork, exactly how many lives remained inside it, and roughly where they were, and how much time they had. The gift expressed itself as a warmth in her sternum, specific and directional, like a compass made of light. She had pulled 11 wolves from a collapsed mine when she was 17. She had located 3 missing pups in a flooded den when she was 19. She had done these things quietly and without ceremony, because the gift itself was quiet, and because Mira had been raised in the tradition that said, you did not perform your usefulness, you exercised it. And then you came home. The bonding ceremony of her 23rd year was supposed to be the formalization of what had always been true. The full moon rising over the Greywater ceremonial grounds, the fires lit at the 4 compass points, the Alpha's voice carrying the old words into the cold air, her hand extended over the binding bowl, her blood meeting the pack's blood in the ancient gesture of mutual claim. She had been ready. She had been more than ready. She had spent months preparing not because she was anxious, but because she was reverent, because she understood what was being offered and what was being asked. And she did not take either lightly. The pack had gathered in full that night, 300 wolves. From the eldest council members in their ceremonial grays to the youngest children who were carried in arms and would not remember this night except as a warmth, a feeling, a sense of something large and important having happened while they slept. Torchlight, cold air carrying the smell of pine and frost, and the particular electric charge that full moon nights always brought, that collective shiver of the animal self becoming more present, more honest, more alive. Alpha Doran Greywater stood at the center of the gathering ground. He was 40 years old and broad in the chest, and had the manner of someone who had never once in his life doubted that he was standing in the right place. His bonded Seraphine stood at his left, a dark-eyed woman of carefully maintained graces who had, in the 11 years of her mating to the Alpha, quietly arranged nearly every significant outcome in the pack's social hierarchy to her own preference, though this was not something that was said aloud in Greywater territory. Mira came forward when her name was called. She remembered the cold of the ceremonial grounds under her bare feet. She remembered the sound of the crowd, that hush that was not quite silence. 300 people breathing together in a dark field, the soft percussion of their collective attention. She remembered the moon, how full it was, how it sat directly overhead, as though it had also been invited and had arrived precisely on time. Alpha Doran looked at her as she approached the binding bowl, and something moved behind his eyes that she did not, in that moment, recognize. She would recognize it later. She would have a great deal of time to think about it, and she would eventually understand exactly what it was. But in that moment, standing in the ceremonial grounds at 23 years old, with her gift warm and alive in her chest, and the moon perfectly overhead, she did not yet know how to read it. He began the words, the old words, the formal words, the words that had been spoken over bonded healers in this pack for 200 years. His voice was steady. She held out her hand over the bowl. And then he stopped. The silence that followed was different from the ceremonial hush. It had a different texture, entirely sharp, disorienting, the silence of something that should be continuing and was not. "There will be no binding tonight," Alpha Doran said. His voice carried. It was designed to carry. Every one of the 300 wolves in that field heard him say it. Mira did not move. She kept her hand extended over the bowl. "The pack has deliberated," he continued. And that was a lie, but she did not yet know the full shape of the lie, only felt its wrongness the way you feel the first shift of weight before something falls. "The council has found that the applicant's gift," and here he used a word for her gift, a specific word, a word from the old traditions that she had never heard applied to herself, and the word meant tainted. The word meant corrupted. The word meant that the gift was not clean, not trustworthy, not safe to bind to a pack's protection, because binding a corrupted gift would be binding poison to the bloodstream. The word was wrong. She knew it was wrong the way she knew the location of a heartbeat through stone. Not because someone had told her, but because the knowledge was internal, structural, as much a part of her as the gift itself. Her gift was not corrupted. Her gift was the cleanest thing in her. She had never once used it for harm. She had never once let it be shaped by anything other than the purest instinct of her nature, which was to go toward the living and help it keep living. But the word had been said, in ceremony, before 300 witnesses, under the full moon, which was the sealing witness the old traditions required. She lowered her hand. She looked at Alpha Doran for a long moment. Behind him, Seraphine's face was arranged in an expression of sorrowful concern so perfect that it had clearly been practiced, and in that arrangement in the too precise grief of the Alphas bonded. In the careful way she held her shoulders and tilted her head, Mira finally began to understand that this was not a decision that had been made last night, or last week, or even last month. This had been arranged. She did not say that. She did not say anything. She took her hand back from over the binding bowl, and she stood in the cold ceremonial grounds under the too full moon, and she let the rejection complete itself, because there was nothing she could do in this moment to prevent it, and there was a kind of dignity in allowing something to be exactly what it was, rather than fighting it in front of witnesses who had already made their decision about what they were seeing. The formal words were spoken, the rejection, the stripping of her status, the severing of her pack tie. These things required their own ceremony, as it turned out. The old traditions had words for this too. Alpha Doran spoke them all, and with each word another thread was pulled from the weaving. And when it was done, she was standing in a field of 300 people, and she was alone in a way that had no equivalent anywhere in the natural world. Pack wolves were not made to be alone. The pack tie was not a metaphor. It was physiological, neurological, woven into the body's own architecture, the way bones were woven into flesh. To sever it was to amputate something that did not have a name only because no one had anticipated needing one. She did not cry. This is important. She did not cry, not because she felt nothing, but because the feeling was too enormous for crying. And because crying would have been a performance of her pain for an audience that had already decided what her pain meant, and she was not willing to give them that. She was not willing to let them watch her break and call it evidence of whatever story they had decided to tell about her. She walked out of the ceremonial grounds with her spine straight and her bare feet silent on the cold ground, and she did not look back. She had not looked back once. The 3 years that followed were the making of her, though she would not have called them that at the time. At the time, she would have called them survival, and then later, she would have called them something harder to name, a long, quiet process of becoming more precisely herself than she had ever been when she had the comfort of belonging, to cushion her against the full weight of her own nature. She went first to the borderlands, because the borderlands asked no questions. The territory between packs, the unclaimed land that no alpha named and no council administered, was populated by the usual collection of rogues and cast-offs and wolves who had, for one reason or another, found themselves outside the formal structures of pack life. It was not a kind place. It was not an unkind place either. It was simply an honest one, in the way that difficult places tend to be honest. It offered nothing, promised nothing, and required that you provide for yourself or do without. She provided. The gift worked outside the pack tie. This was the first thing she learned, and it was an important thing because it contradicted what she had been taught. She had been raised to understand her gift as something that existed in relation to the pack, that drew its strength from the collective and gave it back multiplied. The severing of her pack tie was supposed to have diminished the gift, possibly ended it. That was what the formal traditions said, and it was what Alpha Doran had counted on. She eventually understood that she would leave the ceremony not only stripped of standing, but stripped of the thing that made her remarkable, and that she would spend the rest of her life being exactly the nothing he had named her. Instead, the gift expanded. She did not understand it at first. She thought she was imagining things, that the warmth in her sternum was phantom sensation, the spiritual equivalent of the pain a wolf still feels in a limb that has been removed. But the phantom sensation kept being right. She would feel the warmth and follow it and find something alive at the end of it. A trapped animal, a sick child who had wandered from a farmstead, an injured rogue wolf who had fallen in a ravine and was quietly deciding whether to let the cold take him. She pulled him out of the ravine. His name was Fennec, and he was missing 3 fingers from frostbite he had sustained 2 winters ago. And he had the most comprehensive knowledge of borderland medicinal plants she had ever encountered. They did not become friends exactly. They became something more practical than friends. They became useful to each other, and in the borderlands, that was a relationship of considerable depth. Fennec knew people. He knew, specifically, the woman who ran the Hollow Path way station, a former mid-rank wolf named Osen, who had left her pack voluntarily 15 years ago after a dispute with her alpha's new mate, and had built, in the borderlands, something that was not a pack and did not call itself one, but that functioned as a network of mutual aid, extending across 4 territories in an informal web of favors and expertise. and the particular solidarity of people who had been told they were nothing and had decided not to believe it. Osen took one look at Mira and said, "What do you need?" Mira said, "A place to sleep and something to do." Osen gave her both, and then she gave her more. She gave her access to the full range of the network, which meant access to packs in crisis. Packs dealing with outbreaks and injuries and disasters that their own healers couldn't manage. Packs who needed someone with an unusual and specifically useful gift and were willing in return to pretend they'd never heard the name Greywater or the word tainted or any of the formal condemnations that followed Mira's name through official channels. This was how Mira spent 3 years learning to be extraordinary in a context where no one was watching and no one was awarding anything. She developed her gift in ways that the formal Greywater tradition had never imagined and would not have permitted. The tradition understood the gift as directional. You sensed life, you moved toward it, you acted. But Mira began to discover that the gift was more dimensional than that the warmth in her sternum carried information beyond location and urgency. She could begin to distinguish between types of life, a pup from an adult, a wolf in fever from a wolf in shock, a living wolf from a dying one, and crucially, from a recently dead one. Because the warmth did not end immediately with death, it faded, and the texture of that fading had a kind of narrative in it, a record of what had happened and how long ago, and what had been felt in the final moments. She did not tell anyone about this. The older part of the gift, the finding and the going toward, was already extraordinary enough to make people uncertain about her. The newer part, the reading of the dying and the recently dead, felt like something she needed to understand herself before she could even think about how to explain it to others. She practiced it quietly. She learned its edges and its limits. She learned that it had a cost, that the deeper she went into the reading, the more of herself she put into it, and that there was a threshold beyond which she would come back altered in small ways, quieter than she had been, her own warmth in her chest burning slightly lower for a day or two, as though the lamp had been lent out and returned a little dimmer. She did not go past the threshold unnecessarily. She was careful with herself in the way that she was careful with everything, not from timidity, but from the deep, practical understanding that she was a resource, that her capacity was finite, and that waste was the one thing she could not afford. She learned to fight in the borderlands because the borderlands sometimes required it. Fennec taught her the first things, the pragmatic, unglamorous combat vocabulary of someone who had survived long enough to know that survival was more about reading situations before they escalated than about what you did once they had. He taught her when to yield and when not to yield, and how to tell the difference, which turned out to be the most valuable thing anyone had ever taught her. Osen's network included 2 former pack soldiers who had been expelled for separate political reasons and were furious about it in separate specific ways, and between them they gave Mira a more formal education in the kind of fighting that didn't depend on rank or a pack's collective strength behind you, the kind that worked when you were alone, when you had only your own body and your own mind, and whatever you had managed to cultivate of the former and clarify of the latter in the time available. She was a fast learner, which surprised people who had expected that a healer would be slow. She was not slow. She was economical, precise, focused in a way that her teachers said was unusual, and that she understood as simply the same quality she brought to the gift, translated into a different medium. She had always known how to give her full attention to one thing. The fighting was just another thing. She did not seek it out. She exercised it when necessary. In the borderlands, necessary came around often enough that after a year, she was competent, and after 2, she was something more than that. She was the kind of opponent that an experienced fighter would look at carefully before deciding whether the thing they wanted was worth what getting it was going to cost them. But she did not carry this as pride. She carried it the way she carried everything in those years, as a tool, as a resource, as a thing that was hers and that served the purpose of allowing her to keep being herself in a world that had formally declared her nothing. The missions that Oseen sent her on were varied and often strange, and they took her through territory that overlapped with or bordered on packs she had not previously known. She worked for several of these packs by proxy. Officially, she was contracted through the way station, which meant the packs didn't have to acknowledge her directly, which suited everyone. She remained officially invisible. The work remained real. She was 3 months into her second year in the borderlands when she first heard the name Calum Voss. The way station hosted travelers, and travelers carried news, and the news from the east was consistent on one point. The Ironwood Pack had a new king, young and unproven and apparently relentless, in a way that was either going to secure the pack's future or destroy it. Depending on who you asked and what their relationship was to the Ironwood Pack's traditional power structure, he was 29 years old. He had taken over from a father who had led by fear and selective cruelty for 3 decades, and the shape of what he was trying to build in the wake of that was still unclear, because he was still, as Fennec put it with characteristic precision, figuring out what he was doing. Mira filed the name the way she filed most names, useful information, held lightly, available if it became relevant. She did not think it would become relevant. She thought this in the specific way that you think things that are going to turn out to be entirely wrong. The name came up again 6 months later, and then twice in the following month, and each time it came with slightly different intelligence. The new king was restructuring the Ironwood's pack hierarchy, flattening the rigid stratification his father had maintained. He was consulting with council members who had been sidelined under the old regime. He had, according to a traveler who had direct connections to the Ironwood's border territory, sent formal diplomatic queries to 2 neighboring packs, proposing something that was not quite an alliance and not quite a trade agreement, but seemed to be trying to invent a third thing that didn't have a name yet. Mira found this interesting. She found it interesting in the cautious, qualified way that she found most things interesting in those years, with the awareness that interesting was not the same as safe, that an unusual leader in an uncertain transition was as likely to be dangerous as to be good, and that her opinion of his intentions was something she was not entitled to form at a distance. She kept the name in the part of her mind that tracked things worth tracking. And then the fire happened. The Stonehaven Denning compound was in the deep borderlands, technically unclaimed territory but functionally maintained by Osen's network as a refuge for pack wolves in crisis. Wolves who had fled dangerous situations. Wolves who were injured and needed recovery time. Wolves with pups who needed safe ground while they navigated the complicated aftermath of whatever had fractured their previous circumstances. It was not a secret. Exactly, people who needed to know about it did know about it, but it was not publicly registered with any pack council, and the wolves who passed through it were not cataloged or named. On the night of the fire, there were 9 nursing pups in the compound's eastern wing. Their mother, a wolf named Sarah, who had arrived 3 weeks prior with bad burns on her arms from a fire she had fled in her previous pack's territory, had died 2 days earlier from an infection that the borderlands' limited resources had not been enough to combat. The pups had been nursed collectively since then by 3 other wolves in the compound who had milk to spare. They were 7 days old. They had never been named. No one knew how the fire started. The eastern wing went up fast, too fast for the old timber framing, which suggested something accelerant was involved. Though there was no certainty about this, and Mira did not speculate about it in the moment, because in the moment, there was no time for speculation. There was time only for the gift, which activated with a violence she had not experienced before, all 9 lives registering in her sternum like 9 separate points of heat, 9 bright, specific urgencies arranged in the spatial map the gift was building in her mind, and she was moving before she had consciously decided to move. She went in 7 times before anyone else in the compound had recovered from the shock enough to try to help. She went in 7 times and came back with pups gathered into the fabric of her shift, pressed against her body, transferred to the hands of whoever was standing at the edge of the smoke with enough presence of mind to receive them. Between the 7th and 8th trips, she paused long enough to drink a cup of water that someone pressed into her hands and to look at the map in her sternum, which told her 2 more still in there, 2 more small, urgent warmths in the collapsing geometry of the eastern wing. She went in 2 more times. The 9th time was the time the beam came down behind her. The 9th time was the time she walked back through the threshold into the courtyard and found herself held by hands she didn't know, looked at by eyes she had never seen at this proximity. Amber eyes, in a face that was doing something complicated, something that was not quite awe and not quite horror, but was the particular expression that appears on the face of someone watching a thing that has broken every assumption. They came in with Calum Voss, king of the Ironwood Pack, 40 miles outside his own territory, standing at the edge of a disaster he had no official role in, counting. 9, he said. And she held his gaze and did not answer yet, because she had 9 pups and burns on her back and smoke in her lungs, and there was still a hierarchy of needs to address, and he was somewhere lower on that hierarchy than the pups were, regardless of who he was. She turned away from him and crossed to the woman who was managing the pup collection area, a young wolf named Dara, who had organized blankets and warmth sources and was working with focused efficiency. And she transferred the 9th pup from beneath her ruined shift to Dara's waiting hands. All 9, she said. Her voice came out rougher than she intended, smoke-scraped and low. Dara counted, looked up. Her eyes were wet. All 9, she confirmed. Mira felt the warmth in her sternum settle, not disappear, but shift, the emergency register giving way to the lower hum of living things at safe proximity. She breathed through it. She breathed through it twice, and then she sat down on the ground of the courtyard because her legs had made a decision without consulting her, and it would have been rude to override them. Calum Voss sat down next to her. He did this without asking and without ceremony, simply folding himself down to the ground beside her with the directness of a man who had decided something and was acting on it. He smelled of pine and distance, 40 miles of night travel, and underneath that, something that her gift registered as unexpectedly, uncomplicatedly clean, though she had no framework yet for what that meant about him. You went in 9 times, he said. It was not a question. There were 9 pups, she said. He was quiet for a moment. In the space of that silence, she became aware of several things simultaneously. The pain in her back where the heat had gotten through, the way her hands were trembling slightly now that they had nothing to grip, the fact that it was very late and the moon was setting and she could not remember the last time she had slept. Your pack stands aside, he said, another non-question, a careful statement. I have no pack, she said. And she said it the way she had learned to say it over 3 years, not as a wound displayed, not as an invitation, simply as a fact. The way you say the sky is dark, the way you say it is cold. A fact about the current conditions. He turned to look at her then, fully. She could feel the quality of his attention even through the exhaustion, even through the smoke still sitting in her lungs. It was the kind of attention that came from someone who had learned, probably the hard way, that what you thought you saw and what was actually there were rarely identical. "Tell me your name," he said. "Mira Colwyn." She watched him process it. She watched the name go in and register against whatever intelligence his network had already given him. Because a man who had crossed 40 miles in the night to a disaster in the borderlands was not a man who moved without information. He had known things were wrong here before he arrived. He had known enough to come. She watched the moment when the name connected to whatever he'd heard about the Greywater rejection, the ceremony, the formal condemnation. She watched him, not blink. "The Greywater Pack's former bonded healer," he said. "Former," she agreed. "Who just carried 9 pups through a burning building. The pups needed carrying." He looked at her for another long moment. His hands were on his knees. She noticed that they were large and that they were still. And that stillness in hands was something she had learned to read as a marker of character, because hands at rest told you what someone did when they thought they weren't being observed. "The Greywater Pack told the council your gift was corrupted," he said. "Yes. Was it?" "No. One word. No performance. No argument. No evidence. No appeal. Just the clean fact of it." He nodded slowly, and she watched something in his face shift, not dramatically, not the way it happened in stories where realizations rewrote expressions entirely. It was subtle, structural. A small internal adjustment, the kind that happens when a weight you have been carrying on one side is redistributed. "I know what they took from you," he said. She looked at him, then really looked, for the first time since she had turned from the fire and found him there. He was younger than she had expected from the reputation, and there was something in his face that she had seen before in other faces, a specific tiredness. The tiredness of someone who had been given power they did not ask for in a situation they did not choose, and who has spent the intervening time trying to make something good from it without a reliable map. "You don't," she said, not unkindly, just accurately. He accepted that too. "Not entirely," he said, "but I know what it looks like from the outside. I've been looking for it." A pause. "Looking for you." She was quiet. The pups made soft sounds from the blanket station. The fire behind them was settling into the deep red work of embers, the structural crisis over, the long cooling beginning. "Why?" she said. "Because someone lied to the council," he said, "and I have been trying for 8 months to prove it, and I needed to find the person the lie was told about." The story came out slowly, over the following hours, not all at once, not neatly, but in the way that important things tend to emerge between people who are both careful and exhausted, in pieces, in pauses, in the moments between other conversations. Calum had not come to the borderlands because of the fire. He had come because his network had placed Mira in this region, at this way station, as the woman contracted for emergency work through Osen's operation. He had been tracking her movements, not to surveil her, but to find a way to approach her that didn't involve simply appearing in her path and demanding her trust, which he had understood from the beginning would be the one guaranteed way to lose it. The fire had made the approach unnecessary. The fire had arranged the meeting on its own terms. What he told her about the lie was this: Seraphine Greywater, the Alpha's bonded, had wanted the bonded healer position for her own niece, a young woman of modest gift who would, if the formal bonding had occurred, have locked up the most significant formal status available to a female wolf in the pack's hierarchy for the next 2 decades. The bonded healer position could not be given to someone while another wolf held it. It could only be cleared by death or formal condemnation. Seraphine had chosen condemnation because it was faster and because she believed, correctly as it turned out, that she could construct the evidence for the corruption charge in a way that would satisfy the council's requirements. She had constructed it very carefully. She had used a real event, a recovery mission Mira had conducted 2 years before the ceremony, in which a wolf had died despite Mira's intervention, and had built around it a narrative in which the death was not a failure of circumstance, but evidence of deliberate harm. She had found 3 wolves willing to testify to a version of events that Mira had not witnessed because she had been inside a burning structure while it was happening, which meant she had no direct counter-testimony to offer. It had been enough. Calum had found this out because one of the 3 wolves who had testified against Mira had, 8 months ago, come to the Ironwood Pack's eastern border in the company of his mate and a newborn, seeking refuge from a deteriorating situation in Greywater territory. He had told the story not to expose Seraphine, but because he was dying of the guilt of it and needed to put it somewhere before it consumed him entirely. Calum had listened to the whole of it, and then he had done what Mira now recognized, in retrospect, as characteristic of him. He had not reacted immediately. He had sat with it. He had spent 8 months verifying what could be verified and building the kind of case that a formal council would have to take seriously, because he was not interested in revenge or drama. He was interested in the truth being documented and corrected in a way that was real rather than merely satisfying. He had needed Mira's testimony to complete it, her account of the events she had actually witnessed, her account of the gift as she had experienced it from the inside. He had needed her to be willing to speak. She looked at him across the courtyard in the early pre-dawn light, with the embers settling behind them and the pups breathing steadily from the blanket station, and she thought about what it had cost her to not speak for 3 years. She thought about the choice she had made in the ceremonial grounds, the choice to walk out with her spine straight and her silence intact, to not give them her breaking for free. She thought about what it would mean to speak now and whether it was different and why. He was different because he had asked, because he had spent 8 months looking for a way to ask her that wasn't a demand, because he had come 40 miles in the night and stood at the edge of a burning building and counted, and the counting meant that he had already seen her before she said a single word, had already taken the measure of what she was and found it not the word Seraphine had chosen. Not the word Alpha Doran had carried into the ceremony and set down like a stone over the grave of something that wasn't dead, found it clean. The warmth in her sternum was doing something new. She had learned to read the gift in its many registers, had catalogued its textures and frequencies, had spent 3 years mapping its dimensions. That this particular sensation was not in any map she had made. It was not an emergency warmth. It was not the bright, specific urgency of a life in danger. It was something quieter and stranger and more persistent. Something that, she realized with a slowness that had nothing to do with lack of intelligence, and everything to do with the fact that she had not been in proximity to anyone who made her feel this before, was directional. It was pointing at him. She sat with that for a long moment. The pups breathed, the embers cooled. Calum waited, because he was, it turned out, a man who knew how to wait. "I'll speak," she said. He exhaled slowly. "Good," he said, and the single word carried more weight than most speeches she had heard, because it was not triumphant. It was simply relieved. They did not go immediately to the council. That was not how it worked. The formal challenge of a pack condemnation required its own preparation, its own documentation, its own careful assembly of witness and record, and Calum had already laid most of the groundwork. What he needed from Mira was a formal sworn testimony before a neutral arbitration body, and this was arranged over the following 2 weeks, during which she remained at the way station, and he made the journey east to his own territory, and then back again, managing both the Ironwood's business and the building of the case simultaneously. He visited twice in those 2 weeks. Both times he arrived with provisions for the way station, practical things, medical supplies, and preserved food and warm goods for the pups, who were still nursing from their collective foster mothers and would need intensive care for another 3 months at least. He did not arrive with fanfare, and he did not arrive with an entourage, just himself and 1 or 2 of his inner circle who had the specific social intelligence to understand that their role here was to be useful and unobtrusive. During those visits, he talked to her, not about the case, or not only about the case, he talked the way someone talks when they are trying to know another person, rather than simply extract something from them. He asked about the borderlands, about Osen's network, about what she had built over 3 years and how. He asked about the gift in a way that was genuinely curious rather than strategically interested. Asked about what it felt like from inside. Asked about the expansion she had experienced after the severance of her pack tie. She told him about the expansion carefully, still uncertain about how much of it to share. She told him the fact of it that the gift had grown rather than diminished without the pack structure. He received this with the focused attention she was becoming accustomed to from him. That quality of being fully heard that was rarer than it should have been, and that she had not had the experience of, not in this way, not from someone of his standing. The old tradition says a gift diminishes outside the pack tie, he said. Yes, and yours didn't. No. That should have been part of the evidence against the charge. If your gift was corrupted, severing the pack tie should have accelerated the corruption or eliminated the gift entirely. She looked at him. The charge was made before anyone considered what would happen after. Because they expected you to disappear, he said. There was a flatness in his voice when he said it. That was not anger. It was past anger. The place you arrive after anger has burned through, and what's left is the clear-eyed documentation of what happened. Yes, she said, they expected me to disappear. And you didn't. No, she said, I didn't. He looked at her with that steady, amber attention. Why didn't you challenge it? He asked. Not then. Later, when you had built enough of a record to be believed. She considered this. It was a fair question, and it deserved a fair answer, because challenging it required standing in front of the structure that had already decided what I was, she said, and I was not willing to do that until I was certain I was doing it on my own terms, not because someone else needed me to. A pause. I needed to need it. For myself, not as a performance of injustice. He was quiet for a moment. Then, and now? She thought about the pups. She thought about Ozen and Fennec, and the 3 years of work done quietly in the dark, the lives pulled from rubble and ravines and fires, the gift expanding in the absence of the structure that was supposed to have contained it. She thought about the warmth in her sternum that had been pointing at this man with patient insistence for 2 weeks. Now someone lied to a council on record, she said, and I've decided I want the record corrected. The arbitration was held at a neutral ground 3 territories north, before a body of 7 elder wolves representing packs that had no direct affiliation with Greywater or Ironwood. Calum had arranged it with the precision that she was learning to recognize as his particular genius. Not brilliance in the dramatic sense, but the kind of careful, thorough, methodical intelligence that built things that held, that did not collapse under scrutiny because they had been built to invite scrutiny and survive it. The testimony of the wolf who had originally lied at the ceremony was heard first. He was a man in genuine anguish, and the anguish was honest, and the council recognized it as honest. He described the event as it had actually occurred Mira's intervention, the wolf's death by causes that had nothing to do with any action on her part. And then Seraphine's approach to him and the two others afterward, the careful construction of an alternative account, the pressure that had been applied to ensure compliance. Then Mira spoke. She described the gift as she had experienced it, the night of the ceremony, the warmth, the certainty, the absolute knowledge from inside her own nature that there was nothing wrong, nothing corrupted, nothing that had been shaped by anything other than its own clean purpose. She described the 3 years. She described the expansion of the gift after the severance. She described the mine and the flooded den and the 9 pups in the burning building, and she described all of these things in the specific practical language of someone reporting what had happened, not what it meant, because the council could determine what it meant, and she trusted them to do so. She described, at Calem's careful suggestion, the gift's newest dimension, the reading of the dying and recently dead. She described it in precise terms, and she offered to demonstrate, and the council provided her with an opportunity to do so. And what she read from the records of a recently deceased member of the Arbitration Council's extended community provided information that no one outside that community could have known, and the confirmation came quietly from 2 council members who had known the deceased personally. The council deliberated for 4 hours. The result was not dramatic. Important things rarely were, in her experience. The formal condemnation was overturned. The record was corrected. A formal finding of misconduct was issued against Seraphine Greywater and against Alpha Doran for his role in allowing the fabricated evidence to proceed. The Pack Council of Greywater Territory was put on formal notice that a review of their leadership structure was required within the next annual cycle. Mira sat in the neutral grounds waiting room and listened to the result being read, and she felt nothing grand. No explosion of relief, no theatrical restoration. She felt something smaller and more solid, the feeling of a thing that had been wrong being set right, a correction, a record amended, the official version of events made to match the actual version of events. She felt clean. Calem was sitting beside her again, the way he had sat beside her in the courtyard. He did not say anything when the result was read. He looked at his hands for a moment, and then he looked at her. And the expression on his face was the same complicated one from the night of the fire, the one that was not quite awe and not quite something else. But that was now, 3 weeks later, less uncertain. "What do you want now?" he asked. She thought about it. The honest answer was complex and had several layers, and the outermost layer was practical. She wanted to go back to the way station and check on the pups, who were 3 weeks old now and still in the intensive phase of their early development. She wanted to sleep for a substantial number of consecutive hours. She wanted, eventually, a meal that someone other than herself had prepared. But underneath those things, the true answer. "I want to go somewhere my gift is understood as an asset," she said. "Not managed, not contained, understood." He was quiet. "I want to work," she continued. "I want what I built in the borderlands to be built somewhere with more resources. I want the people I'm responsible to." She paused, choosing the word deliberately. Responsible to rather than responsible for, because that distinction had become important to her in 3 years of learning the difference. "I want them to be safe." Calem Voss, king of the Ironwood Pack, looked at her for a long, steady moment in the neutral grounds waiting room, with the arbitration result cooling in the air between them. "I've been restructuring the Ironwood's support infrastructure," he said. "The Pack has a formal healer position. It's been vacant for 11 months. My father," a pause in which he did not elaborate on what his father had been, because he did not need to, because she had heard enough to understand. the position was misused under the previous administration. I'm rebuilding it." She waited. "It would require a formal bonding ceremony," he said. "Conducted correctly this time, with a council that has reviewed and approved the candidate's record." He met her eyes. "Your record is now clear." "My record," she said, "was always clear." "Yes," he said, "it was." A long quiet. Outside the neutral grounds windows, the sky was doing the thing it did in the late afternoon of late autumn, the light going golden and long, the shadows extending in the specific way that happened when the sun was low, but not yet gone, that last generous hour before the dark. "The bonding ceremony binds the healer to the pack," she said, "not to the alpha." "Yes." "I want that distinction respected." "It will be. And I want it in writing," she said. "Formal council documentation. The precise terms of the bonded healer's autonomy within the pack's structure." He did not hesitate. "Done," he said. "And the way station," she said. "OSIN's network. I want formal Ironwood recognition extended to the way station and its affiliated operations. Not control, recognition, legitimacy." He considered this for exactly as long as it deserved, which was not long. "Done," he said again. She looked at him. The warmth in her sternum was steady and directional, and no longer surprised her, though she was still learning what to do with it, still learning what it meant that her gift, which was not sentimental, which dealt in the factual physics of life and death, and the space between them, was pointing at this man with such consistent and unhurried certainty. "There's one more thing," she said. He waited. "The gift," she said. "The newer part. The reading of the dying." She paused. "I don't know yet what it can do or what it costs, fully. I know its general parameters. I don't know its ceiling. I want the space to find out without being asked to perform it on demand." He looked at her steadily. "The gift belongs to you," he said. "It's yours to understand and yours to extend. I am not asking you to give me access to something I don't own. I'm asking you to bring yourself to a place where you can work." She breathed. In and out. The long golden light came through the windows. "All right," she said. The bonding ceremony of the Ironwood Pack was conducted on the full moon of deep winter, 6 weeks after the arbitration result. It was not the same ceremony she had stood in 3 years before, different grounds, different moon phase, but same fullness, different alpha, different everything that mattered. That the bowl was there, and the compass fires were there, and the old words were there, because the old words were not wrong. They had just been misused, and reclaiming them rather than discarding them felt like the correct kind of correction. The Ironwood Pack had gathered in full. She did not count them. She walked to the center of the ceremonial ground, with her spine straight and her feet bare against the cold earth, and she held her hand over the binding bowl, and she did not need the moon to confirm anything about her, because she had not needed anything outside herself to confirm anything about her for 3 years, and that had not changed. Calum stood at the center of the gathering ground. He was in formal ceremonial dress, and his amber eyes found her immediately as she approached, and they did not leave her. And the quality of his attention across that distance was the same quality she had felt for 6 weeks, the full weight of it, unperforming, just present. He spoke the old words. His voice was steady and low, and carried through the cold air without effort. And the words were the correct words used correctly for the first time in a ceremony that involved her. And as each word was spoken, she felt the bonding settle into her, not as something added, not as something external grafted onto her, but as something recognized, confirmed, seen. The warmth in her sternum expanded. not dramatically, not as an explosion. As a door opening in a room you had always been in, revealing a view you had suspected was there. She pressed her palm to the bowl. She felt the pack. All of them, hundreds of lives, hundreds of separate warmths, the vast collective breathing of a living thing that was made of individual things and was more than the sum of them. She felt Calum at the center of it, specific and warm and oriented toward her the way her gift had been oriented toward him, and that was when she finally understood that the warmth in her sternum had not been only the gift, had not been only the healer's compass finding a clean life. It had been the mate bond finding its direction. She looked at him across the binding bowl. The moon was directly overhead. The council fire burned at the 4 compass points. The pack breathed around them in the cold. He was looking at her with the expression she now knew well, the one that was not quite awe and not quite something else, but that had been clarifying itself over 6 weeks into something definite and clear. Something that had the same quality as the arbitration result and the writing of the formal terms and the extension of recognition to Osin's network, the quality of a thing that had been wrong and was now correct. She held the warmth, steady. She let it be what it was, the gift, the bond, the 3 years of becoming, the 9 pups, the 9 trips, the fire, the hands on her back, the counting. She let all of it be true at once, which was possible because she had spent 3 years learning that complexity was not a problem to be solved, but a terrain to be inhabited. The ceremony completed, the binding settled, the pack's collective warmth wove itself around hers, and she let it, and it did not diminish her. It met her where she was, and held there, which was the correct way for belonging to work, not containing, not consuming, but surrounding, supporting, the way good ground supports a deep root. Calum spoke the final formal words, and then he stepped forward, past the ceremony's formality, and he said in his own voice, under the moon, and in front of his entire pack, "She was never corrupted. She was always this. Everything we receive from her gift is a gift she is choosing to give us, and we will honor that distinction every day." The pack was quiet, and then the elder on the council's left side, a woman of 70 years, white-haired and still, the pack's oldest formal record keeper, said, "Witnessed." And the word went around the circle, from wolf to wolf, witnessed, 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 carried on 300 separate voices until it was everywhere in the cold air. Mira stood at the center of all of it and felt the rightness of it the way she felt the rightness of a heartbeat through stone. Not because someone had told her it was right, but because the knowledge was internal, structural, as much a part of her as the gift itself. After the ceremony, in the quiet that followed the crowd's dispersal, she found herself standing again at the edge of a threshold, this one not burning. This one, simply a doorway from the ceremonial grounds into the covered passage beyond. The passage that led to the warm interior of the Ironwood's main hall, where the fires were already lit and the food was already prepared, and the 9 pups, transported from the way station 3 days ago and sleeping in a heated nursery under the watch of 3 careful attendants, were breathing steadily in the new place that was also their place. Calum stood beside her. Not in front of her. Beside. She felt the mate bond, which was not an emergency and not an urgency, but was the steadiest warmth she had ever known, pointing at him with its quiet, unwavering certainty. She had carried 9 lives through the fire. She had carried herself through 3 years of nothing and come out the other side with more than she had started with, which was not how stories were supposed to work, and was exactly how this one had. She crossed the threshold into the warmth. He crossed it with her, which was, in the end, the only resolution she had ever needed, not rescue, not restoration of what had been taken, but recognition of what had never been lost, freely given and freely received by the choice of two people who had learned, each in their own hard way, that the difference between a life diminished and a life fully inhabited was the willingness to stand in the full light of what you actually were and let it be witnessed.